The cold Yukon wind, swirling with snowflakes, slapped against the glass windows of the Whitehorse Federal Court, but inside the courtroom, the air felt even colder than outside. My husband, Kieran Flynn, rose slowly to his feet, his back straight as a board, as if he weren't vying for property rights at all, but rather being crowned with some kind of honor. "I'm the one who built her career from scratch. Everything she has should rightfully belong half to me," he said, his voice deliberately calm and measured. As his gaze swept across the gallery, it carried a barely perceptible hint of smug arrogance. 8,700,000 Canadian dollars, half ownership of my resort, and the Aurora Ranch, a family legacy cherished by the Mackenzies for 3 generations. His demands were crisp and uncompromising, as if those assets were already his to claim. All eyes in the gallery turned sharply toward me. Pity, sympathy, even a touch of amused mockery, as if I'd already become a doomed prey, and any attempt to fight back would be nothing but superfluous. But no one knew that the hand I'd been clutching beneath the table was tightly gripping a secret powerful enough to turn the entire situation around. Just as the judge reached for his pen and his fingertips were about to touch the verdict, I slowly slid a leather folder across the smooth tabletop, my voice low but clear and forceful. "Your Honor, please don't rush to sign just yet." In an instant, the hushed murmurs in the courtroom came to a sudden halt, and for the first time, the smug expression on Kieran's face began to crack. "My name is Ella Mackenzie, and what you're about to hear is the story of how the man who once tried to destroy me ultimately reaped what he'd sown, and brought ruin upon himself. Before I begin my tale, I'd like to know that you're with me. Just leave a comment saying, 'I'm listening,' or let me know where you're watching from. I'm truly curious to see how far my story can reach. Sometimes, even the tiniest connection can make a story feel truly heard. Thank you all. Now, my story is about to begin." If you'd like to join me on this journey ahead, don't forget to subscribe to this channel. Your support means more than you can imagine, especially for someone who's had to start from scratch and rebuild everything from the ground up. I stood in the parking lot of the Whitehorse Federal Courthouse, clutching tightly the folder that had long since become the very foundation of my survival. Once again, Lyle's sharp, arrogant voice echoed endlessly in my mind. "I'm the one who created a life for her. Her property rightfully belongs to me." The first time I heard those words, I was utterly shocked. But now, looking back, something deep within me has grown even harder. None of this was a coincidence, nor was it some fleeting impulse. Every step that brought me to this parking lot had been paved by a series of betrayals I'd failed to recognize at the time. I took a deep breath, letting the frigid Yukon air calm the trembling in my ribs. This wasn't the life I'd dreamed of as a young girl. Growing up on the Mackenzie family's Aurora Ranch, a piece of land my family had fiercely protected over 3 generations, back then, during summer months, I'd help my father repair fences and round up cattle. My fingernails were always stained with dirt, my shoulders burned by the sun, yet I dreamed of one day building a business that would endure just as long as the ranch itself. It was this dream that carried me through countless late nights in college, times when I worked part-time on construction crews to earn enough money for tuition. And it was this same dream that gave me the strength to sign the papers at age 26, launching the Mackenzie Aurora Ecotourism Resort. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that the small business I'd started from the back of a pickup truck would one day grow into one of the most respected construction companies in the Yukon, the Northwest Territories, and Nunavut. I should have felt proud. I should have felt fulfilled. But instead, here I stood outside a courthouse, preparing to defend everything I'd built with my own 2 hands, not against competitors, but against the very man who'd once sworn to protect me. When I met Kieran Flynn, we'd already been married for 22 years. At the time, he was a rising star, a local history curator from the northern region, witty in his speech, and endowed with an innate, compelling authority in his voice. I fell in love with the way he listened, with the encouragement and support he gave me when everyone else doubted that a woman could ever lead an architectural firm. For a long time, I thought he was the only person who truly understood me. But sometime along the way, perhaps when the TV station he worked for laid off staff, over the past 5 years, losing his job gradually eroded his confidence and allowed resentment to take root and spread within him. Yet I kept trying to make amends in the only way I knew how, giving more and more. More money, more comfort, more excuses. Our peaceful life in Dawson City began to show signs of cracking, that I spent too much time managing construction sites across multiple states, and he grumbled that I cared more about contracts than about him. Even though it wasn't really my fault to apologize, I took the initiative to admit my mistake. And even though I knew full well he'd never tried to change his own situation, I still blamed myself for his unhappiness. I'd always assumed we were just going through a rough patch, but that rough patch couldn't possibly explain everything that followed. The first visible crack appeared one early morning, when I was reviewing foundation scan reports at the site of the camp supporting the Yukon Aurora Observatory. My office manager called me, her voice tense. At 2 a.m., someone had logged into our internal system using an employee account and downloaded several documents related to major contracts. She felt I needed to know about this right away. Indeed, I did need to know. But at that moment, I still didn't fully grasp the gravity of what she was telling me. If only I'd known then what those documents meant, what they implied, I might have been able to quell the storm before it gathered enough power to destroy my entire life. But I didn't. That night, I went back to the man I'd always trusted, never imagining that he'd already begun slowly unraveling my whole world. The change started with something utterly trivial, so minor that I almost dismissed it altogether. One evening, during dinner, Lyle asked me how much my new fleet of excavators was worth, not in casual conversation, not out of mere curiosity, but with the seriousness of someone preparing for an exam. Then he went on to ask about depreciation schedules, operating costs, and the number of pieces of equipment we owned outright. After 22 years of marriage, he'd never shown the slightest interest in the machinery that kept our company running. His questions pierced my chest like sharp needles. I tried to mask it with laughter, but an inexplicable sense of unease began to creep into my heart. By the second week, when I spoke on the phone with the operations manager, I noticed he was quietly jotting down notes in a small black notebook nearby. When I asked him why, he said he wanted to learn more about my work. His words were gentle, yet his tone had an artificial stiffness, almost as if he'd rehearsed them carefully. That uneasy feeling took root deep within me. Later, I returned early from the construction site and caught him in my home office, half hidden behind the door, using his phone to photograph documents like insurance summaries and asset lists. As soon as he saw me enter, he hastily put away his phone and lied, claiming he was looking for tax documents. Yet all my important files were locked securely in the safe, and he knew it perfectly well. I still tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, that stress was making me paranoid. But then, a message popped up on his phone, shattering any remaining illusions. The message was from Kasia, the company's administrative assistant, who asked, "Are you sure she hasn't noticed anything unusual yet?" My throat felt tight, and I struggled to come up with a plausible excuse, yet the knot in my chest only grew heavier. A few days later, I had dinner with several female entrepreneur friends, and we started talking about his sudden interest in the company's finances, a behavior that seemed highly unusual. One of my friends, a lawyer who specializes in indigenous land rights and commercial disputes, put down her fork and said firmly, reminding me, when a spouse suddenly starts asking questions about money they've never cared about before, it's usually not out of curiosity. It's because they're making preparations. Those words felt like a stone settling deep within my heart. But little did I expect that very evening, I'd receive an email from the IT department. They'd already completed their investigation into the 2 a.m. system intrusion. The login account used to download confidential files belonged to Samantha Dugan, the woman who'd sent a message to my husband. Moreover, the files she'd accessed far exceeded the scope of her authorized permissions, not by accident, but deliberately. For the first time in my life, I'd been forced to admit a possibility. The man I trusted might be hiding something even more dangerous than mere unhappiness, something carefully planned and deliberately orchestrated, and it's only just the beginning. I didn't confront Lyle right away. Confronting someone without solid evidence would only give them time to destroy any incriminating proof. My gut told me that whatever he was up to, he'd already been doing it for quite some time. So I hired Lena McKenna, a former Royal Canadian Mounted Police economic crimes investigator from the Yukon, specializing in cases of commercial fraud. I gave her only the information she needed, and she didn't waste a single moment asking unnecessary questions. Within hours, she'd begun tracking Lyle and Casia's movements. The very first report she sent me sent a chill down my spine. Every evening around 6 p.m., Kasia would leave her office but never head home. Her phone signal would show up at a small hotel just outside the town of Camax, exactly the kind of place business travelers stop at on their way through. Lyle's phone also had similar periods of signal blackouts, times that perfectly overlapped with Casia's. At home, he seemed tired, distant, and preoccupied. Whenever I asked him how his day had been, he'd always say, "I'm just really exhausted," just as he usually did. A few days later, during breakfast, he was unusually excited and proactively brought up the contract for the Yukon River viewing boardwalk, the biggest project we've undertaken this year. I couldn't help but wonder, how long has he been lying like this, and how come I never noticed? He even shared some details that I'd never told him and that weren't printed anywhere in our home. I stared at him for a moment, unsure of how I was supposed to respond. He just smiled and said he wanted to keep pace with me more closely. But what I heard beneath his words was something entirely different. He'd somehow gotten hold of information that he shouldn't have had access to. That afternoon, Lena sent me a set of photos. Lyle walking into a hotel room in Camax town together with Kasia. The two of them appeared there for no apparent reason. There was no doubt it was an act of betrayal. What they're after isn't just my company. It's also my marriage, my trust, and everything I've spent my entire life building. At the next construction site meeting, the chief technician mentioned that Kasia had recently asked him for a list of liquidatable assets. On the surface, I remained calm, but deep down, my heart suddenly tightened. This list was either meant to sell off assets or to divide them up. Clearly, they'd been eyeing a share of my company all along. That evening, sitting in the pitch-dark living room, I reflected on our 22-year marriage and couldn't help but wonder, was it career failure that made Lyle insatiable, or had I simply mistaken charm for character and ambition for loyalty from the very beginning? The more I thought about it, the more terrified I became. Perhaps he'd never really changed. Maybe I'd just never seen through him. Then Lena's second report delivered the final blow. Data she'd extracted from Lyle's old backups showed that 15 months earlier, long before Kasia joined the company, long before those late-night interrogations, the system breaches, and even before my mother passed away, he'd already been searching for divorce lawyers, strategies for dividing assets, and ways to secretly appraise his spouse's company. 15 months. That means from then on, every single act of kindness and every bit of comfort he offered was carefully disguised. The betrayal had already begun. I'd merely been living right in the middle of his calculations. I finally realized the storm had been brewing all along. I just hadn't noticed it before. The next day, when I walked into the office, everything around me seemed unchanged, but there was an eerie sense that everything was being watched, that everything was under scrutiny. Knowing that Lair had been plotting for so long, the tension inside me shifted to a sense of urgency. His plan was meticulously crafted, and I had to be faster and more composed than ever. I immediately reached out to my lawyer, Sheila O'Connor, and handed over all the evidence related to Lena. After reading it, Sheila bluntly told me that if Lair filed for divorce at this point, he'd be entitled to half of my company's shares, as well as half ownership of Aurora Ranch. Just thinking about him laying claim to the land our family had guarded for generations made me feel utterly sick. Before I could even fall apart emotionally, Harper leaned forward and said, "We still have time to act, but we've got to move now." I agreed, so it was settled, and the plan went into action. At home, I pretended everything was normal, but secretly I transferred all of the company's major assets, equipment, real estate, and equity in long-term projects, to Well Holdings LLC. On the surface, it still looked like a thriving construction empire, but in reality, it was now legally owned by an independent entity entirely under my control. Next, I transferred the ranch into the Well Family Trust, ensuring that no matter what happened to my marriage, this land, a sacred place steeped in my family's history, would never fall into the hands of outsiders. With trembling hands, I signed every single document, and only when the process was finally complete did I feel a flicker of relief. A few days later, Harper called with unsettling news. A colleague from her other law firm had mentioned that Lyle had reached out to him, asking how to value a spouse's business, how to obtain internal financial records, and how to argue in court that the other party had been mismanaging the company. He wasn't just preparing to leave, he was preparing to utterly crush me. That realization didn't break me. On the contrary, it only made me more determined. That same afternoon, the IT department alerted me that someone had been using Kasha's workstation, attempting to access newly migrated files she had absolutely no reason to know existed. The timing couldn't have been more obvious. Lyle had run out of patience, and neither of them had much time left. That evening, when Lyle came home, I looked at him with entirely new eyes. He sat at the dinner table, sipping wine, as if we were still an ordinary couple living an ordinary life. I casually asked him what plans he had for the coming months, and he smiled, saying he was planning something big for the two of us. The way he said the two of us made my skin crawl. It was too smooth, too self-assured, too deliberate. What he meant by the two of us was actually himself. The next day, Delaney made another discovery. She'd intercepted an audio recording of Lyle and Cassia walking in the parking lot. Lyle told her that once the divorce was finalized, the contract for the Yukon River viewing platform, the very contract that belonged to me, would become theirs. He even said I had no idea just how easy it would be to split up the company once that happened. Hearing my husband reduce decades of my hard work and risk to nothing more than a trivial matter he could casually divide like splitting a restaurant bill, it ignited something inside me that had been dormant for months, a fierce determination. I returned to the office, completed all pending asset transfers, changed my passwords, restricted access rights, and tightened every internal security protocol. My employees didn't know why, and they didn't need to know, at least not yet. That evening, standing in the hallway outside our bedroom door, I heard Lyle on the phone telling Cassia that everything was going exactly according to plan, and that I was so distracted I wouldn't notice a thing if anything unusual were to happen. I realized he thought he'd already won. Later, lying in bed and staring at the ceiling, I suddenly and crystal clearly understood something. Confrontation was inevitable, and Lyle would undoubtedly make the first move. But for the first time since it all began, I felt the tide of the situation starting to turn in my favor. He'd spent 15 months plotting how to destroy me, while I was finally beginning to plot how to survive him. And survival, real survival, I'd learned long ago, ever since the day I'd grown old enough to walk across the fields of the Mackenzie family's Aurora Ranch. Delaney's full report was sealed in an envelope, and even before I opened it, I could sense that the final pieces of the truth were falling into place. Inside were photographs I'd always been reluctant to look at. Lyle and Cassia stepping into a hotel room, hand in hand, their faces pressed so close together, not the kind of distance you'd expect between colleagues. There were receipts, timestamps, corridor surveillance footage, all clearly visible and irrefutable. Next to each photo was another betrayal. Documents revealed how Kasha had secretly obtained internal reports, asset records, and valuation charts, all meticulously organized. It was obvious that she and Lyle were already plotting to argue that everything I owned should be divided equally between them. Even worse, Lena discovered that Lyle had opened a bank account in a small town just across the state line using an anonymous shell company as a front. He'd been quietly transferring funds in small increments, laying the groundwork for absconding with the money. Clearly, he didn't just want to take everything from me, he was also securing an escape route for himself. That very night, through the crack under my bedroom door, I heard him softly urging the person on the other end of the phone. It's time to file the application. Make absolutely sure the court freezes all my assets immediately. Clutching the doorframe tightly, I suddenly realized that he'd treated our marriage like nothing more than an enforceable financial transaction. There was no longer any panic in my heart, only clarity remained. I fell silent and stepped up my efforts, transferring all our core assets to Well Holdings within just 2 days. Equipment, warehouses, and office buildings, all were seamlessly transferred. The Mackenzie Aurora Ecotourism Resort, which Lyle had long coveted, was reduced to nothing more than an empty shell, a mere operating contract. Meanwhile, the IT team reported that Cassia had downloaded the full cost projections for the Dawson-Whitehorse Aurora Viewing Highway, Yukon's largest state-funded project. When questioned, she even lied outright, claiming it was my instruction. Standing in the doorway of the conference room, I watched her lie with a completely blank expression. Instinctively, I wanted to expose her lies, but I forced myself to hold back. Silence was my only advantage. Soon after, Lyle formally filed for divorce, and at the top of the petition, in bold letters, he laid out his demands. $8.5 million, half ownership of the resort, half ownership of the Aurora Ranch, plus $10,000 per month in alimony. I read the documents twice, not because I didn't understand them, but precisely to see clearly through this man's greed and shamelessness. That evening, sitting at the dinner table and meeting his expectant gaze, I calmly replied, "Fine, I agree." The shock on his face vanished in an instant, and his lawyer hurriedly called to say they were open to negotiation. But I firmly reiterated, he can have whatever he wants. He thought I'd already given up, little knowing that I'd already laid out my plan long ago. Late at night, alone in the kitchen, amid the hum of the refrigerator, a sudden clarity washed over me. Accepting wasn't surrender. It was the first step toward turning the tables. This isn't failure, it's strategy. Months of fear began to dissipate, and my resolve took full control. After submitting the documents, I fully entered a state of readiness. Harper and I met every night, meticulously going over each document, sorting through mountains of evidence, their extramarital affairs, data theft, shell companies, hacked files, and the complete legal structure of Well Holdings and the Well Family Trust. Building this case brick by brick, we not only had to prove what Lyle had done, but also how he planned to keep reaping profits even after he'd left me. During that time, Cassia sent me an email confirming everything Delaney had uncovered. The email was brief and formally worded, yet it carried a subtle undercurrent of hostility. She wrote that she hoped I'd fully cooperate in accordance with the law regarding the handover of financial documents, and added, refusal could lead to further complications. I read the email twice, not to verify its contents, but simply to savor her arrogance. They were convinced they'd cornered me completely, unaware that I'd already left myself an escape route. Lyle's attitude grew increasingly brazen. At a gathering of mutual friends, he teased me, saying, "After all this, you'll have to start over from scratch," his laughter laced with hidden menace, his eyes cold as ice. Though my friends felt uneasy, they couldn't quite put their finger on what was wrong, while I knew full well. His blatant boasting was nothing more than a display of confidence, proof that he was absolutely certain of his victory. Bold. Soon after, Lena discovered something even more alarming. Lyle had been in contact with a major contractor in Yellowknife, leaked my client list, and even hinted that he'd join their firm after the divorce, providing them with inside information on the resort's core operations. Clearly, his goal wasn't just to take over the company. He intended to strip it bare, pocket the funds, and flee. I immediately launched a counterattack. I changed the company-wide access permissions, revamped the security protocols, and transferred 5 key contracts to Ver Holdings. At last, I'd uncovered his full sinister plan, but what I hadn't anticipated was hearing him brag about it firsthand. One evening, I ran into him in the hallway, talking on speakerphone, and he said outright, "Once the court divides up the assets, I'll finally get everything that rightfully belongs to me." His tone was dripping with smug satisfaction, completely oblivious to all the years of effort I'd poured into the company. In that moment, it became crystal clear. He'd never once acknowledged my success. Deep down, he'd always believed that everything I'd achieved should have been his all along. Even worse, he'd unilaterally and without permission traveled to the Mackenzie family's Aurora Ranch, pressuring the manager to cooperate in appraising the assets. Bold. Hearing the ranch manager's call, I felt a deep, quiet rage well up inside me. The land that had carried my family's history belonged to my family long before I ever met him, and it had already been transferred into a trust fund, completely independent of him. As soon as I hung up the phone, I found myself strangely calm. The boundaries of this battle were now crystal clear. Though the storm he'd stirred had reached its peak, for the first time, I no longer felt afraid. After months of preparation, he'd been determined to take everything from me, and I'd been ready to strike back. Before sunrise, I arrived at the federal court in Whitehorse. my briefcase heavy with documents containing irrefutable evidence that would shatter his year-long web of lies. Though I was utterly exhausted from days of meticulous planning, my heart was unbearably steady. I wasn't stepping into a courtroom. I was walking into the final act of the war he'd thought I'd surely lose. Just minutes before the hearing began, Lyle and his lawyer, specializing in indigenous land rights and commercial disputes, arrived. His face was suffused with arrogance, his posture radiating confidence. Kasia sat behind me, dressed impeccably, her face radiating the smug satisfaction of someone who's already counting her share. They were absolutely certain I'd lose the ranch, the company, and all my money. After all, I'd previously agreed to every single term without so much as a flicker of resistance. My expression remained utterly blank, giving away not a hint of emotion. As the hearing began, the opposing lawyer launched into his argument with rehearsed confidence, portraying Lyle as the architect of my career and exaggerating his emotional contributions and support. Then Lyle stood up and uttered those words that had clearly been prepared long in advance. I'm the one who created a life for her. Her assets rightfully belong to me. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I let those words linger in the air, committing each syllable vividly to memory, as if adding them to my own evidence folder. When the judge turned to me and asked whether I had any objections to the terms, I replied clearly and calmly, "No, Your Honor, I agree." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. Lyle grinned broadly, his shoulders relaxing as if everything had unfolded exactly as he'd anticipated. Kasia lowered her head and nodded. Deep down, she felt she'd already won. Just as the judge reached for his pen, preparing to sign the verdict, I stood up. "Your Honor," I said, clutching the folder tightly, "I have additional documents that I'd like the court to review." The court officer handed the folder to the judge's bench, and suddenly, the courtroom fell utterly silent. Hidden inside the folder was crucial evidence Lyle hadn't yet discovered. Proof that Well Holdings held all of the operational assets, the family trust documents ensuring the ranch remained untouchable, evidence of his extramarital affair with Kasia, records of Kasia's unauthorized access to confidential data, documentation of funds he'd transferred through shell companies, and even an audio recording revealing his plot to seize control of my company. As the judge slowly flipped through the documents, his expression grew increasingly serious. "Mr. Mercer," the judge said, staring directly at Lyle, "the assets you're seeking to divide no longer qualify as marital property and cannot be awarded to you." Lyle's eyes darted nervously, his confusion quickly giving way to panic. Even his lawyer looked stunned, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly collapsed. Just as Lyle's confidence completely crumbled, I delivered my final blow. "Your Honor, I'm willing to settle for $800,000 in cash. Otherwise, we'll embark on a litigation process that could drag on for years." A deathly silence spread across Lyle's face, a silence he'd never known before. For the first time, he realized that the weapon he'd been holding all along was actually pointed right at himself. The judge then turned to the issue of the data breach. "The documents reveal that someone has illegally accessed the company's systems. This matter will be referred to the authorities for investigation." Kasia's face paled instantly, and she stared at Lyle in horror, finally understanding that even he couldn't protect himself anymore. Lyle's lawyer requested a recess. When we returned once more, the arrogance in Lyle's eyes had been replaced by insignificance and fear, and he accepted the settlement. As I watched him sign the documents, renouncing all claims against the company, I felt utterly lucid. It had taken me 22 years to see through his true nature, yet it had taken only 22 minutes to reclaim everything that rightfully belonged to me. The final signing ceremony took place at a quiet law firm in downtown Missoula, one that specializes in Native American land rights and commercial disputes in the northern region. There was no argument, no last-ditch debate, just the formal conclusion of something that had already come to an end long before the legal documents were even finalized. Lyle sat across from me, head bowed, shoulders slumped. The arrogance he'd carried when he walked into the courtroom was nowhere to be seen. From beginning to end, he didn't once look at me. The silence between us was so profound that for the first time, I truly felt our marriage was really over. Not with a bang, but with an emptiness and an ending that left nothing behind. He signed his name mechanically, page after page, like a man who was severing all ties with the life he'd once thought was his own. I didn't feel the sense of triumph people often imagine. Instead, I felt only relief, the kind you get after months of heightened vigilance, finally able to take a deep, slow breath. Just hours before the meeting was set to begin, I received a notice from Human Resources. Kasha had been fired and was now under formal investigation for illegally accessing company data. She and Lyle had stopped communicating altogether. Both were too afraid of implicating each other. As soon as consequences loomed, their alliance crumbled in an instant. My company needed to rebuild, from its structure and culture to the trust among employees and the leadership itself, all of which had been shaken by this storm. Harper and I spent weeks overhauling the security systems, tightening protocols, and reassigning department heads. The people who remained were those we could truly rely on. Then, an unexpected turn of events occurred. Yukon's Infrastructure and Tourism Board, the very client I'd been worried about losing, proactively reached out to me, saying they'd already taken stock of the entire situation and expressed their desire to continue honoring our contract. They said they respected the way I'd steered the company through the crisis with composure and determination. It felt like a second chance, not just for the company, but for me as well. Once everything had settled down, I drove back to the Mackenzie family's Aurora Ranch. The evening sunlight spilled across the vast expanse of land, painting the mountaintops golden. I took a deep breath of the cool, familiar air and finally felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in months. I renovated the old cabin my mother had loved so much during her lifetime, carefully replacing beams, sanding the floors, and replanting the flowers she'd cherished most along the porch. I slowed down my pace, rediscovering the person I'd been before the betrayal had left its scars. But the ultimate sense of relief came unexpectedly. Harper placed a folder on my desk, a financial audit report on Lyle's activities. The evidence inside showed that even after he'd managed to seize my company, he'd never once considered sharing anything with me. Not a single penny would ever make its way into my account. Every asset, every bit of value belonged solely to him. After reading this report, the last vestige of bitterness in my heart finally melted away. He'd never loved anything I'd built. His only passion was the thrill of possessing it all, and from the very beginning, he'd had no chance of winning. Several months later, the Mackenzie Aurora Eco-Tourism Resort was rebuilt and reorganized, emerging stronger than ever before. We'd won the contract for the Dawson-Whitehorse Aurora Viewing Highway, a contract that ranked among the largest in the state's history. It was an acknowledgement I'd never anticipated. One evening, gazing into the distance across the pasture, I softly spoke the truth I'd earned through sheer effort. They thought taking away my assets would break me, but little did they know, it would only compel me to rebuild a self that's stronger, wiser, and utterly unbreakable. The greatest revenge isn't ever to destroy them. It's to watch them crumble utterly in the very plan they'd so carefully laid out for themselves. And so, I closed the final chapter of a life that had long since ceased to be mine, stepping resolutely into the life that truly belonged to me. As the last signature was affixed and the door behind me clicked shut, I walked out of that law firm, specializing in indigenous land rights and commercial disputes in the northern region, feeling lighter than I had in years. Not the lightness of victory, but the lightness of freedom. Sometimes, the feeling of simply surviving is this calm, almost tender. There were no celebrations waiting for me, no grand moments of triumph, just steady breathing, clear thoughts, and the quiet reassurance of having safeguarded everything my ancestors had worked so hard to build. Perhaps even more important, I'd managed to protect myself. Looking back now, I no longer feel anger over what I've lost. Instead, I'm grateful that this experience ultimately taught me. True strength isn't about loud declarations, revenge doesn't need raging flames, and sometimes freedom comes cloaked in the guise of heartbreak. Everything Lyle tried to take from me never truly belonged to him in the first place, and everything I rebuilt afterward stemmed solely from within myself. If you've made it this far and listened to my story, I'm truly grateful. Sharing it wasn't easy, but knowing that someone on the other side of the screen is listening makes all the weight feel just a little lighter. If any part of my journey has reminded you of your own struggles, your own betrayals, or your own path of rebuilding, I hope you'll remember this. You're stronger than you ever imagined. Before you leave, say, "Still listening" in the comments, or let me know where you're watching from. Your presence means more than you realize. If you'd like to keep accompanying me and witnessing the next chapter of this new life I'm building, don't forget to subscribe. Sometimes, weathering the storm isn't true victory. Sometimes, becoming someone who no longer fears the storm, that's the real victory.